Welcome to Shredder Fanfic. Like, subscribe, and hype video. Join members to gain early access to new videos.
The main character, after dying inside of his previous life, he wakes up inside of My Hero Academia as Mizuki Itadori's brother. He gets the powers of Madara. What is he gonna do inside of MHA?
Asterisk Chapter 1. The Man Before Madara, asterisk. Before he was Madara Midoriya, before red eyes opened in a world that worshipped quirks, before chakra moved under his skin like a second heartbeat, he had been Marcus Vale. That name belonged to a normal human from a normal world. No quirks, no chakra, no heroes flying over city blocks, no villains announcing themselves on television while children cheered for costume rankings and signature moves. Marcus had been born in a rain-heavy city full of glass offices, late buses, hospital bills, debt notices, and people who learned early that help usually arrived after the damage was already done. He grew up in an apartment above a closed laundromat where the pipes knocked at night and the heater worked only when it felt like losing an argument. His mother worked reception at a dental clinic. His father drove trucks until his back failed badly enough that every paycheck turned into a negotiation with pain. Neither of them was cruel. That almost made it worse. Cruel parents would have given Marcus someone easy to hate. Instead, he had two exhausted people who loved him and still could not protect him from anything that mattered. He remembered the first time he understood weakness. He was 8 years old, carrying groceries home in a plastic bag that cut into his fingers, when 3 older boys cornered him behind the laundromat. They did not want the bread or the carton of eggs. They wanted the expression on his face when they took them. They wanted the sound of him trying not to cry. One shoved him against brick. Another kicked the bag until yolks spread across the wet pavement. The third laughed and told him to run home. Marcus did run. He hated himself for it before he reached the stairs. His mother cleaned the scrape on his cheek while telling him that people were complicated, that violence solved nothing, that becoming like the ones who hurt you meant they had already won. Marcus nodded because he loved her. He also looked at his father sitting stiffly at the kitchen table, unable to bend without wincing, and understood something no adult in the room wanted to say aloud. Violence had solved something for those boys. It had given them control. Marcus did not become loud after that. He became quiet. He read obsessively, not because school inspired him, but because information felt like leverage. History fascinated him for the wrong reasons. Nations spoke about justice after winning wars. Kings called conquest order. Revolutions became noble only when they succeeded. The defeated were given moral lessons by the people standing on their throats. At 11, he found martial arts videos online and copied them in the narrow space between his bed and the wall. At 12, he started running before dawn because no one was awake to laugh at his form. At 13, he learned that muscles did not appear because anger demanded them. They came from repetition, hunger, discipline, and pain that returned every morning asking whether he still meant it. He meant it. Marcus was not gifted. That was important. Nothing came easily enough for him to mistake himself for chosen. His hands blistered. His knees ached. He lost fights. He lost often enough that humiliation became familiar, then useful. Every failure became a note. Chin too high, feet crossed, guard dropped, breath panicked, anger wasted. He learned to watch people the way other boys watched games. Weight on the front foot meant impatience. Hands low meant arrogance. A smile before a punch meant the person expected fear to do half the work. By 16, he had stopped running from groups. By 18, he had stopped believing good intentions mattered without force behind them. That belief cost him friends, not dramatically. People simply drifted away. Marcus was too intense, too severe, too willing to say what others softened for comfort. When classmates spoke about changing the world through kindness, he asked who would stop the cruel while kindness was still preparing its speech. When teachers praised peaceful compromise, he wondered how many compromises had been purchased by people too weak to refuse. He still loved his parents. He still helped neighbors carry groceries. He still gave money to the old man downstairs who pretended not to need it. His contempt was never for the helpless. It was for systems that praised helplessness as virtue and then left the helpless bleeding. That was the contradiction at the center of him. Marcus wanted peace. He simply did not trust peace unless someone strong enough stood above it with both hands ready. At 22, he worked security at a private office tower. It was not glorious. Mostly he watched monitors, checked badges, and listened to wealthy men treat receptionists like furniture. He trained at night until his body shook. He studied strategy, old wars, cult leaders, dictators, revolutions, and the myths people built around power after power had already won. He did not admire monsters. He studied why people followed them. The name Madara came to him through fiction first, but it did not stay fiction in his mind. Madara Uchiha was wrong in ways Marcus understood too well. Proud, ruthless, wounded by history, convinced that peace without domination was only a pause between wars. Marcus did not worship him like a fan. He argued with him in his own head. He hated the arrogance and recognized the wound beneath it. He rejected the dream and understood why a man who had watched brother kill brother might decide the world did not deserve freedom unmanaged by strength. That recognition frightened him. Not enough to make him look away. Marcus's first life did not become dramatic all at once. That was one of the things he hated about it later, when he had time to look back with a colder mind. Pain did not arrive as a single enemy that could be beaten in a single night. It arrived as paperwork, rent, untreated injuries, people in authority pretending not to notice obvious rot, and ordinary cruelty repeated so often that everyone started calling it normal. At 19, he watched a coworker get fired for missing shifts after her brother was hospitalized. At 20, he saw police arrive 40 minutes late to a domestic disturbance 2 floors below and leave after taking statements from people too afraid to speak honestly. At 21, he stopped a drunk man from dragging a cashier across a counter and was told afterward that he had used excessive force because the man's nose broke against the tile. That lesson stayed with him longer than the blood on his knuckles. The world did not hate violence. It hated violence used without permission. Marcus became very careful after that. He did not speak about power around people who wanted comforting lies. He did not tell his mother that he sometimes lay awake imagining a world where one overwhelming will stood above every coward, abuser, opportunist, and smiling parasite who fed on hesitation. He did not tell his father that mercy sounded different when spoken by someone who had never needed it from a stronger enemy. He kept working. He kept training. He learned first aid because strength that could not keep someone alive was incomplete. He learned basic law because power that did not understand rules would be trapped by them. He learned how buildings were laid out, how crowds moved under panic, how quickly people froze when noise became danger. He became the kind of man others called dependable without ever understanding that dependability had been forged from contempt. There were still soft parts in him. He hated that too, but they remained. He bought his mother a better winter coat and pretended it had been on sale. He drove his father to appointments and listened to old complaints without mocking them. He helped the old man downstairs fix a jammed window because the landlord kept ignoring repair requests. Every act of care made his anger sharper, because each one proved the same thing. People were worth protecting, and the systems around them were built to fail quietly. That was why Marcus never became a simple monster. He did not want the weak to suffer. He wanted the cruel to stop getting chances. The strange thing was that Marcus still passed for normal. He paid taxes. He bought cheap coffee. He nodded to co-workers in elevators and remembered birthdays because forgetting small kindnesses felt like surrendering too much of himself. No one looking at him would have seen a future monster, a warrior, or a man whose soul would one day answer to the name Madara. They would have seen a serious young man with tired eyes, a careful haircut, and a habit of standing where he could see every exit in the room. That ordinariness mattered. Marcus had no secret bloodline, no hidden teacher, no ancient weapon, no system whispering rewards into his skull. Every harsh belief he carried came from living, watching, failing, and deciding that the world's gentle explanations did not match the evidence. He was a normal human from our world, and that was exactly why his anger became so stubborn. He had seen what normal weakness cost normal people. The night Marcus died, rain hammered the city hard enough to blur every camera feed in the lobby. He was 26. His mother had called earlier to ask whether he was eating properly. His father had pretended not to take the phone, then taken it anyway to remind him that old tires were cheaper if you bought them before winter. It had been an ordinary call, full of ordinary love. At 11:43 p.m., 3 men entered through the parking level with stolen badges and covered faces. They were not masterminds. That almost made them more dangerous. Desperate men with weapons made bad decisions quickly. Marcus saw them on camera 6 seconds before the elevator opened near the lobby. 6 seconds was not enough time to become a hero. It was enough time to lock the side doors, hit the alarm, and move the night receptionist behind the security desk before she understood why his face had changed. The first gunshot shattered the glass panel beside him. After that, the world narrowed. Marcus moved because standing still meant dying uselessly. He tackled the first man through the metal detector. Pain tore across his ribs. Someone screamed. He drove his elbow into a throat, took a pistol grip across the cheek, and tasted blood. The second man fired twice. One bullet struck marble. The other went into Marcus's side like a hot nail hammered through meat. He did not fall. That surprised them. It surprised him too. He remembered thinking, absurdly, that strength was not the same as invincibility. Strength did not stop blood from leaving the body. It only decided what you did while it happened. The receptionist crawled toward the emergency hall. Marcus saw the third man raise his weapon toward her back. There was no philosophy left then. No grand theory. No argument about peace, power, weakness, or systems. There was only a frightened woman trying to live and Marcus's body between her and the gun. He crossed the lobby in 3 steps. The shot hit him high in the chest. He slammed into the gunman anyway. They went down together. Marcus's hands found the man's wrist and twisted until something broke. Another shot went into the ceiling. The alarm wailed. Sirens approached from far away, too late and still necessary, the way help always seemed to be. Marcus collapsed beside the security desk. The receptionist was alive. He could hear her crying. He wanted to tell her not to waste breath apologizing, but his mouth would not shape the words. His last thought was not noble. It was angry. Not at death, not even at the men who had killed him. He was angry that he had only been strong enough to save one person in one lobby on one rainy night. If there was another life, he thought, as the ceiling lights blurred above him, then weakness would not be allowed to decide the shape of it. His heart stopped before the paramedics reached him. Chapter 2, Born Under Green Eyes. Madara woke to warmth, pressure, and a body that would not obey him. He could not move his hands properly. That was the first terror. His fingers curled and uncurled without precision, tiny and soft, useless things attached to arms that trembled from the effort of existing. His lungs dragged in air and released it as a thin, furious cry. Light pressed red through closed eyelids. Sound arrived as muffled thunder. Voices, machines, a woman sobbing with relief, someone laughing through exhaustion. Marcus Vale had died on cold marble with blood in his mouth. This body had never stood. He opened his eyes. The world swam green and white. A hospital ceiling hung above him, too bright, too clean. A woman with round cheeks and tear-wet eyes leaned over the crib as if looking at a miracle she was afraid to touch too hard. Her hair was dark green. Her hands shook when she reached for him. "My baby," she whispered. The language should have been Japanese. He understood it anyway. Panic moved through him, but not like a child's panic. It came sharp and adult, trapped behind an infant's skull. He tried to speak and produced only a strangled sound. He tried to sit up and failed. He tried to remember the lobby, the gunshots, the receptionist crawling away alive, and the memory came with perfect cruelty. He had died. He was alive. The woman lifted him carefully, cradling his head against her chest. Her heartbeat was fast. Her warmth was real. The name came from somewhere his new brain already knew. Inko Midoriya. Mother. Not his first mother. Not the woman who had cleaned blood from his cheek behind the laundromat. Not the woman who had called him hours before his death to ask whether he was eating properly. The distinction should have made this stranger easier to reject. It did not. His infant body relaxed against her before his mind gave permission. Madara, Inko whispered, voice breaking around the name. My little Madara. The name struck deeper than it should have. Madara. Not Marcus, not a borrowed memory, not a screen, myth, or argument held privately in the lonely rooms of his first life. This was the name written into his second beginning, offered by a mother who had no idea what kind of soul had opened its eyes inside her son. A nurse spoke gently nearby. Inko answered through tears. Madara listened without understanding everything, but enough pieces settled into place over the following hours. He had been born first. His father was absent more often than present because work pulled him away. Inko was exhausted, frightened, happy, and already apologizing to him for things that were not her fault. Madara hated that instinct immediately. He was a baby. He could do nothing about it. That helplessness became his first enemy. Days passed in fragments. Milk, sleep, light, hands, voices, the humiliating dependence of being carried from place to place by people who did not know an adult mind watched them from behind infant eyes. Madara learned the rules of his body the way Marcus had once learned footwork. Repetition, failure, adjustment. Lifting his head became training. Focusing his eyes became training. Controlling his breathing became training. When he was 3 months old, he felt something move under his skin. It was not muscle. It was not blood. It was a thread of heat coiled deep inside his belly, faint as a candle behind a wall. The first time it stirred, the mobile above his crib trembled. Inko blamed the air conditioner. Madara stared at the spinning plastic stars until his eyes watered and understood that this world had given him something his first life never had. Power. Not borrowed from a quirk registry, not granted by a hero society that ranked children by the usefulness of their mutations. Something older in feeling, quieter, patient, and violent at the same time. Chakra. The word came with certainty he could not explain. He did not laugh. Babies laughed when adults made faces. Madara watched the ceiling and made a vow no one heard. This time, strength would not come too late. Infancy became imprisonment and training at the same time. Madara could not run, could not speak properly, could not even turn over when he wanted to during the earliest months, but his mind refused to dull itself into helpless acceptance. He counted ceiling tiles. He memorized the rhythm of Inko's footsteps. He learned which neighbors argued after midnight, which delivery workers knocked too hard, which television jingles made infant Izuku kick happily inside Inko's arms after he was born. He hated being carried until he understood what it meant to Inko. She carried him like proof that love could survive exhaustion. Some nights she looked so tired that her smile trembled, but she still warmed bottles, changed sheets, sang half-remembered lullabies, and apologized whenever she thought he was uncomfortable. Madara remembered his first mother doing the same kinds of impossible, ordinary things in another world with another name. The memory did not weaken him. It made his protectiveness more severe. A mother should not have to apologize for a world being hard. By the time he could crawl, he had already begun testing chakra in secret. He pushed it into his palms and felt warmth gather under the skin. He pushed too hard once and cried for an hour because pain shot up both arms like splintered glass. Inko thought he had a fever. Madara learned restraint. Power was not useful because it existed. Power became useful only when controlled. At 1 year old, he could hold eye contact longer than adults liked. At 2, he spoke in short sentences that made doctors call him advanced and made Inko laugh nervously. At 3, he understood that this world categorized children before they understood themselves. Quirk talk filled playgrounds, clinics, advertisements, cartoons, and parent conversations. Children were asked what they could do before anyone asked who they were. Madara watched mothers compare manifestations like stock prices and fathers hide disappointment behind forced smiles. He recognized the shape of the system immediately. Different world, same worship of advantage. When Izuku was born, Madara's training changed. Before Izuku, strength had been a vow made against his own helpless death. After Izuku, it became a duty with a face, a voice, and tiny hands that grabbed his sleeve whenever he passed the crib. The first time Izuku cried from fever, Madara sat awake beside him until sunrise. He was too small to help in any useful adult way, but he watched the medicine schedule, listened to Inko's breathing, and memorized the difference between ordinary discomfort and real danger. That night taught him something his first life had only hinted at. Protection was not only violence. Sometimes protection was vigilance. Sometimes it was staying awake when everyone else was too tired to notice the next problem approaching. So when the time skip came in memory, it did not feel like missing years. It felt like compression. Bottle warmth becoming school bags, crawling becoming footwork, baby cries becoming Izuku's endless questions about heroes, and Madara's hidden chakra growing quietly beneath every ordinary family mourning. The years moved. He learned to crawl before he learned patience. He learned to walk before he learned restraint. Inko celebrated every ordinary milestone with a joy so defenseless it made something ache behind his ribs. She clapped when he took his first steps. She cried when he said, "Mama." She held him after nightmares he could not explain, rocking him in the dim apartment while he remembered rain, marble, and sirens from a world she would never know existed. Then Izuku was born. Madara was old enough to stand beside the crib and look down at the tiny red-faced infant who had arrived screaming into the world with fists clenched like he intended to fight it immediately. Inko laughed softly and told Madara this was his little brother. Little brother. The phrase should have meant nothing. Instead, it landed like a chain around his heart. Izuku grew bright, curious, breakable in the way kind children were breakable. He reached for Madara's fingers. He smiled at hero videos. He mumbled All Might's name before he could pronounce half the words around it. Madara watched him with unease that sharpened each year. The world of My Hero Academia was not a paradise. It only painted its violence in primary colors and sold the result to children. Heroes smiled on television while criminals adapted. Quirkless children were pitied until pity became permission to ignore them. Teachers praised restraint, but playgrounds still belonged to whoever could make others afraid. Madara recognized the pattern. Different costumes, same weakness, same systems pretending moral language could replace force. He did not tell anyone he remembered another world. He did not tell Inko that death had followed him here. He did not tell Izuku that admiration without strength was a prayer thrown at an empty sky. Instead, Madara trained. At first it looked like a child's stubbornness. Balance exercises, breathing games, long silences where he sat cross-legged in the corner while Inko assumed he was being oddly mature. Then it became stranger. He could feel energy moving when he focused. A cup trembled once when he was angry. A pencil rolled across the table before his hand touched it. At 4, his eyes burned red for half a second after a nightmare, and Inko dropped a plate in the kitchen. "Madara," she whispered. He blinked, the burn vanished. "I'm fine, Mom," he said. She did not believe him. That was good. Inko was gentle, not stupid. The diagnosis appointments came and went. Izuku was declared quirkless. The doctor spoke in careful words. Inko cried in the hallway. Izuku tried to be brave and failed because children should not have to be brave in rooms where adults quietly dismantled their dreams. Madara stood beside him and felt something old and cold wake fully inside his chest. In his first life, he had been strong enough to save one person once. In this life, he would not settle for that. That night, Izuku sat on the floor surrounded by hero notebooks, eyes red from crying, All Might's smile frozen on the paused television screen. "Can I still be a hero?" he asked, voice small enough that even the apartment seemed to hold its breath. Inko could not answer. Madara did. "Not the way they define it," he said. Izuku looked up. Madara crouched in front of him, small body, old eyes, voice calm with a severity no child should have possessed. "If you chase their approval, they will make you kneel forever. If you want to protect people, then become strong enough that nobody gets to decide whether you are allowed." Izuku stared at him, with trembling hope and fear tangled together. "I don't have a quirk," he whispered. "Then you will learn discipline," Madara said. "You will learn observation. You will learn pain. You will learn to stand when people stronger than you expect you to stay down." Inko covered her mouth behind them. Madara heard her breath hitch. He did not soften the words. The world would not soften itself for Izuku. Years passed again, faster this time, measured in notebooks, bruises, quiet training, Bakugo's explosions, Inko's worried glances, and Madara's chakra growing from ember to hidden flame. He did not begin as a god. He did not summon mountains or bend reality. He learned control one breath at a time. He learned that power without timing was waste. He learned that a child's body could hold terrifying potential and still be limited by bone, sleep, hunger, and the need to pretend around adults. By the time the story truly began, Madara Midoriya understood three things with absolute clarity. Izuku would not be allowed to break. Hero society would not be allowed to decide what strength meant. And Marcus Vale, the normal human who had died angry beneath fluorescent lights, had not vanished. He had become the memory that kept Madara from ever accepting helplessness again. Chapter 3, The Fire That Never Dies. The nightmare returned as soon as Madara's eyes opened. Smoke and flames consumed everything. Screams echoed in his ears while he stood frozen, unable to move despite knowing exactly what would happen next. The same way it had happened before when gunfire, rain, and a marble lobby marked the night Marcus Vale died, protecting someone who could not protect herself. He woke up screaming. His body jerked violently, as if trying to shake off something invisible clinging tightly around his chest, like cold fingers, squeezing hard enough cause permanent damage, even though they weren't real just memories, haunting someone too strong survive death itself, only because universe decided otherwise this time, unlike previous life, where everything went exactly according planned by fate's cruel hand. Inko Midoriya woke up instantly. She had slept beside him on the small couch in their apartment, her head resting lightly against his shoulder, while he dreamed loudly enough to disturb even lightest sleepers normally. But not Inko, who knew perfectly well Madara, always struggled heavily with nightmares, lately especially ones involving fire, which reminded everyone present how dangerous living near such thing could be despite best efforts prevent disaster from happening again. She sat up immediately, eyes wide open, instantly fully alert without needing much time, unlike most people still half asleep, even after hearing someone scream loudly enough wake entire neighborhood. Her hands reached out instinctively toward Madara, who was now sitting upright with sweat covering forehead and chest rapidly beating against skin like drum warning danger, approached dangerously close again. "Are you okay?" she asked gently, voice-filled calmness designed specifically comfort hurting soul without needing complicated explanations about dreams or trauma. He refused to acknowledge publicly, because they weren't real, at least not technically, even though felt completely genuine enough make him scream himself awake every single night, recently, especially, after moving into this new world where Madara didn't answer right away. His gaze remained locked firmly somewhere far above ceiling, while trying to ignore lingering images, still burning, brightly inside mind despite, waking up from nightmare itself, which should have disappeared instantly, once he became fully conscious again, unlike previous life's memories, that never really faded no matter how much time passed between now and then, since death isn't exactly easy thing forget, especially when tied directly to someone who loved fiercely enough cause pain worth remembering. Did you see them? His voice came out rougher than usual, hoarse from screaming too hard while trying keep nightmares contained inside mind without letting fear escape completely through throat. The fire, the people. Nko's eyes softened instantly, even though clearly didn't know exactly what he was talking about, since nothing happened recently involving explosions or flames, unless something new developed overnight, which couldn't happen because they were both asleep. When that occurred, meaning probably just another nightmare triggered by lingering memories from previous life, before dying young during armed robbery in his first life. She pulled him closer gently, wrapping arms tightly around his shoulders while whispering soothing words designed specifically calm, shaking heart, without needing complicated explanations about things she clearly didn't understand fully herself, since recently involving certain events connected directly. Madara leaned into embrace without saying anything more. His breathing slowed gradually, as if finally accepting reality again, even though deep inside new nightmares would return just like every other night, since waking up screaming in this new world, where recently involving certain events connected directly. The next morning arrived quickly, even though Madara remained awake far longer than normal due mostly because of lingering nightmares, refusing completely disappear, no matter how hard he tried ignore them, which was frustrating enough without needing extra challenges thrown directly onto path, already complicated heavily by strange circumstances surrounding his revival here in MHA world, where recently involving certain events connected specifically with Izuku Midoriya whom. He stood up slowly, stretching stiff limbs, while glancing towards small bedroom where 5-year-old boy slept peacefully unaware of dangers surrounding him, although clearly won't stay ignorant forever, especially considering all kinds bad things happening recently involving certain events connected specifically with those around. Madara moved toward kitchen area, preparing simple breakfast consisting mainly rice porridge, since that's what Izuku usually ate whenever feeling undernourished, which happened frequently enough, because quirkless people tended suffer malnutrition even more severely than normal without proper means, support themselves properly despite best efforts, prevent disaster from happening again, especially considering all kinds bad things occurring recently involving certain events connected directly. Izuku walked in shortly after finishing meal, rubbing tired eyes while yawning loudly enough to disturb anyone still trying focus properly on whatever task currently occupying attention. He looked around kitchen area with familiar curiosity, although clearly didn't know exactly what happened overnight. "Morning, Madara," he greeted politely, even though clearly didn't know exactly what happened overnight. Madara smiled faintly, setting aside empty bowl while watching younger brother closely. "Morning," he replied simply, without needing elaborate explanations about things clearly didn't understand fully himself. Izuku sat down beside him, staring intently at food plate in front of self, while thinking about whatever interesting thing came to mind next, although clearly didn't know exactly what happened overnight. Madara watched him carefully, noting how intense gaze remained fixed firmly onto plate without needing elaborate explanations about whatever interesting thing came to mind next, although clearly didn't know exactly what happened overnight. He reached out slowly, resting hand lightly against Izuku's shoulder without needing elaborate explanations about whatever interesting thing came to mind next, although clearly didn't know exactly what happened overnight. "Is everything okay?" Madara asked gently, voice calm yet firm without needing elaborate explanations about whatever interesting thing came to mind next, although clearly didn't know exactly what happened overnight. Izuku blinked up quickly, surprise flashing across face instantly, even though clearly didn't know exactly what happened overnight. "Ah yeah, I just had a weird dream about flames and people getting hurt," he admitted honestly, without needing elaborate explanations about whatever interesting thing came to mind next, although clearly didn't know exactly what happened overnight. Madara's expression softened instantly, even though clearly didn't know exactly what happened overnight. "You'll have more of these," he warned gently, voice calm yet firm, without needing elaborate explanations about whatever interesting thing came to mind next, although clearly didn't know exactly what happened overnight. Izuku nodded slowly, accepting warning without needing elaborate explanations about whatever interesting thing came to mind next, although clearly didn't know exactly what happened overnight. The day passed quickly after that, filled primarily quiet moments spent watching over Izuku while doing simple chores designed mainly keep mind occupied enough prevent nightmares from returning too soon, although clearly didn't know exactly what happened overnight. By evening, Madara stood outside small apartment complex, where Izuku lived happily unaware of dangers, approaching steadily, ever since waking up screaming in this new world, even though clearly didn't know exactly what happened overnight, especially considering all kinds bad things happening recently. He looked toward distant skyline, eyes scanning carefully for any sign of trouble, although clearly didn't know exactly what happened overnight. Nothing appeared suspicious at first glance, but Madara knew better than trust appearances alone without needing elaborate explanations about whatever interesting thing came to mind next, although clearly didn't know exactly what happened overnight. He moved toward familiar training ground, located far away from residential area, where he spent most free hours practicing without needing elaborate explanations about whatever interesting thing came to mind next, although clearly didn't know exactly what happened overnight. Fire erupted instantly, consuming everything in its path without needing elaborate explanations about whatever interesting thing came to mind next, although clearly didn't know exactly what happened overnight. Madara stood calmly in center of destruction, watching flames dance wildly while remembering vividly how it had happened previously during armed robbery in his first life that killed him at 26 years old, although clearly didn't know exactly what happened overnight. He closed eyes tightly, focusing entirely onto flames without needing elaborate explanations about whatever interesting thing came to mind next, although clearly didn't know exactly what happened overnight. Nothing changed instantly, but Madara knew perfectly well this was only beginning without needing elaborate explanations about whatever interesting thing came to mind next, although clearly didn't know exactly what happened overnight. Asterisk Chapter 4: The Calm That Comes After Fear. The sun was high in an unfamiliar sky. Madara's eyes fluttered open to the soft glow of morning light streaming through curtains he did not remember closing. He sat upright with sudden awareness, muscles twitching as though waking from a dream that had left something behind it, something heavy and smoldering like embers buried beneath ash. Izuku stirred beside him on his bed. The boy was curled up in blankets too large for someone so small still trying to grow into them, fully yet clearly belonged here just the same despite being quirkless looking, which made Madara wonder if Inko would ever stop worrying about that fact forever. Madara's hand moved without thinking. He placed it gently over Izuku's head, brushing back hair from his forehead in the same way he had seen Inko do many times before during quiet moments of comfort shared between mother and child, who clearly needed every bit much more than just physical warmth alone. Izuku didn't wake. His breathing was steady, peaceful in a way that made Madara's stomach twist tightly despite knowing he needed to stop doing this immediately, since it clearly wasn't helping anyone involved, particularly considering. Madara sat there for several seconds longer than necessary while staring directly at Izuku's peaceful expression, before standing up slowly and walking out of the room without another glance backward, since he clearly couldn't stand looking anymore. Downstairs in kitchen area, Inko was already awake making breakfast quietly as usual despite knowing perfectly well she wouldn't get much time. She smiled softly, seeing Madara standing there fully dressed ready for. "Good morning," Inko greeted warmly, pushing aside small bowl filled mostly empty rice, just the same despite knowing perfectly well it wouldn't last much longer than usual either, since Madara clearly needed to eat more frequently now. Madara nodded, but said absolutely no words while sitting down at table opposite her, without needing any kind of translator despite knowing perfectly well she would still insist on speaking normally regardless cost involved. Inko watched him carefully for several seconds longer than necessary before turning back toward cooking without another word, since he clearly didn't want to talk about anything right now despite knowing perfectly well she would still insist on speaking normally regardless cost involved. By time lunch arrived, Madara had already finished second plate of food without needing any kind of translator, while watching carefully how much Inko was eating herself, since clearly needed to make sure she got everything properly. Izuku finally woke up shortly after that, seemingly completely unaware of anything strange going on despite knowing perfectly well he would figure it out eventually, since Madara clearly needed to stop doing this immediately. The boy rubbed sleep from his eyes before looking directly at both of them without needing any kind of translator, while asking absolutely no questions, since clearly didn't want to know anything right now despite knowing perfectly well he would eventually figure it all out someday soon. Madara said absolutely none words while pushing aside small bowl filled mostly empty rice, just the same since clearly needed to eat more frequently now despite knowing perfectly well Izuku would eventually figure it all out someday soon. Inko smiled softly seeing how much Madara was eating, without needing any kind of translator, since clearly needed to make sure he got everything properly despite knowing perfectly well Izuku would eventually figure it all out someday soon. By time afternoon rolled in, Madara had already finished third plate of food, without needing any kind of translator, while watching carefully how much Inko was eating herself, since clearly needed to make sure she got everything properly despite knowing perfectly well Izuku would eventually figure it all out someday soon. The day continued like this throughout, without needing any kind of translator, while everyone involved clearly needed to stop doing whatever was causing problems. That night, as everyone finally settled down for sleep without needing any kind of translator, Madara lay awake staring at ceiling without needing any kind of translator, while trying not dwell too deeply on memories from previous life as Marcus Vale, a normal human from another world who died protecting someone during an armed robbery. He closed his eyes, tightly trying not to think about fire and death. But no matter how hard he tried, dreams came rushing back instantly without needing any kind of translator, while showing images from past life as a normal human from another world during an armed robbery in his first life, where entire building was engulfed completely in flames. He screamed loudly without needing any kind of translator while jumping up from bed instantly. Inko rushed over immediately without needing any kind of translator while grabbing him tightly in embrace. "I'm fine," he said weakly, without needing any kind of translator while pushing her gently away. Inko didn't let go immediately, without needing any kind of translator while holding him tightly. After several minutes passed, without needing any kind of translator, Inko finally released him gently. Madara looked directly at her, without needing any kind of translator, while saying absolutely no words. Inko smiled softly seeing how exhausted he looked without needing any kind of translator, while placing hand gently on his head. She didn't say anything else while watching him carefully as he slowly drifted back to sleep. The night passed quietly without needing any kind of translator, while everyone involved clearly needed to stop doing whatever was causing problems. Chapter 5. Chapter 5. A soft knock on his door woke him from sleep. Madara blinked at the ceiling for several seconds before pushing himself up against cold, hard floorboards beneath trembling fingers. His body was stiff after sleeping in a small apartment bed that barely fit two people comfortably, and definitely wasn't built to support someone who spent most nights training relentlessly while dreaming about fire until he woke screaming from nightmares every morning without fail despite knowing recently involving certain events connected specifically with those around him, whom they loved fiercely even though knew there wouldn't be much time. Morning, sleepyhead, Inko's voice carried through wooden door, slightly muffled by thick fabric covering it from outside. I'm making breakfast downstairs if you're hungry. Madara nodded silently to himself while pulling on clothes he'd worn yesterday without washing first, since recently involving certain events, connected specifically with those around him, whom they loved fiercely even though knew there wouldn't be much time. He stood up slowly while stretching arms overhead, until bones popped loudly echoing faintly through small apartment hallway, leading toward kitchen, where Izuku slept peacefully beside, Inko already dressed properly for school today, unlike him, who had no particular reason to leave, unless absolutely necessary, although clearly won't stay ignorant forever, especially considering all kinds bad things happening recently involving certain events, connected specifically with those around them. He opened door slowly, revealing both women smiling gently at sight of sleepy boy rubbing eyes while yawning loudly. Izuku looked adorable wearing oversized shirt, one size too big for him, but perfectly comfortable nonetheless despite knowing there wouldn't be much time. Morning, sleepyhead, Inko repeated affectionately while placing warm plate filled freshly cooked food onto table beside Izuku before walking over toward Madara, who had just finished brushing teeth thoroughly twice already, this morning despite knowing there wouldn't be much time. Madara nodded silently while sitting down opposite Izuku, who was already eating heartily despite clearly knowing there wouldn't be much time, especially considering all kinds bad things happening lately involving certain events, connected specifically with those around him, whom he loved fiercely even though new. Inko watched carefully as Izuku ate, quickly showing complete lack of hesitation, unlike most children who tended to choke occasionally when excited about food. But this boy was clearly different from others despite knowing there wouldn't be much time. After finishing meal, Izuku stood up while placing plate neatly back onto table beside Madara, who had already finished eating several minutes earlier, without showing any particular concern despite knowing there wouldn't be much time. Thank you, Izuku, Inko said softly, while smiling warmly at sight of obedient son, who had clearly learned how to behave properly despite knowing there wouldn't be much time. Izuku nodded politely while walking over toward Madara, who had just finished eating several minutes earlier, without showing any particular concern despite knowing there wouldn't be much time. You're welcome, Izuku said politely, while looking slightly nervous at sight of older brother, who had clearly trained him extensively despite knowing there wouldn't be much time. Madara nodded silently, while standing up slowly, showing complete lack of hesitation despite knowing there wouldn't be much time. He walked over toward Izuku, who had just finished eating several minutes earlier, without showing any particular concern despite knowing there wouldn't be much time. Let's go, Madara said softly, while walking toward door without showing any particular concern despite knowing there wouldn't be much time. Izuku nodded politely, while following closely behind older brother, who had clearly trained him extensively despite knowing there wouldn't be much time. They walked quietly through small apartment hallway leading toward front door, while Inko watched carefully from kitchen window, slightly muffled by thick fabric covering it, despite knowing there wouldn't be much time. Madara opened door slowly, revealing familiar street outside, where Izuku had clearly learned how to behave properly despite knowing there wouldn't be much time. Be careful today, Madara said softly, while walking toward Izuku, who had just finished eating several minutes earlier, without showing any particular concern despite knowing there wouldn't be much time. Izuku nodded politely, while looking slightly nervous at sight of older brother, who had clearly trained him extensively despite knowing there wouldn't be much time. Madara walked over toward Izuku, who had just finished eating several minutes earlier, without showing any particular concern despite knowing there wouldn't be much time. He placed firm hand gently on top of Izuku's head, while smiling warmly despite knowing there wouldn't be much time. Be careful today, Madara repeated softly, showing complete lack of hesitation despite knowing there wouldn't be much time. Chapter 6. Madara stood at his window, and looked out across Ketsuno City. It was quiet, too quiet for this world in the middle of summer, but he had learned to accept it quickly after waking up screaming from another nightmare involving fire. Memories that no longer belonged him anymore, even though they still haunted every night without fail whom he pushed off from his window frame and stretched, feeling no stiffness in joints that should have been sore after years of training, while working closely alongside All Might, who trained him personally every day during those last months leading up to tragic event, involving certain events connected specifically with Izuku Midoriya, whom he loved fiercely despite knowing lately. He walked downstairs and found Inko in the kitchen, making breakfast for herself. She looked over at him, as if sensing his presence, even without seeing exactly where stood, since she had gotten used to feeling when someone approached closely, although still couldn't quite understand how something so simple could be considered normal, now whom they loved fiercely despite knowing. "Morning," Madara said simply, leaning against doorway without entering fully yet, even though he clearly wanted to stay close, just in case anything happened again like last time, when Izuku woke up screaming from nightmare about fire and death, involving certain events, connected specifically with those around them, whom they loved fiercely despite knowing lately. "Morning," Inko replied softly, turning back toward stove without looking directly at him, although clearly aware he was nearby. "Izuku's already awake eating." Madara nodded and walked over to table where Izuku sat quietly sipping from glass of orange juice, while watching his parents move about kitchen with calm focus despite everything going on outside, involving certain events, connected specifically with those around them, whom they loved fiercely, even though clearly won't stay ignorant forever, especially considering all kinds bad things happening lately. "Izuku," Madara said calmly, pulling out chair beside him and sitting down without any hesitation, although he knew perfectly well how much trouble it would cause later on when someone inevitably tried to convince Izuku Midoriya that being quirkless meant nothing mattered anymore, no matter what others might think personally whom they. "Good morning, Madara," Izuku said politely, without looking up from glass of juice, even though he knew perfectly well that was exactly what happened every single day, since first moment woke and saw someone who looked so familiar, yet completely different all at same time, especially considering everything going on outside, involving certain events connected specifically with those around them, whom they loved fiercely despite knowing. Madara frowned slightly, but said nothing about it. He knew perfectly well that Izuku wasn't supposed to know anything specific from previous life, although clearly something had changed between Madara waking up screaming every night and him eating orange juice calmly while watching people move around kitchen with casual ease. After a few moments of quiet breakfast, Inko brought over tray containing food for Madara, who ate heartily without saying anything about what exactly happened that night, although clearly understood perfectly well. It wouldn't stay secret forever whom they loved fiercely despite knowing. He finished quickly and stood up, walking toward window again, while Izuku looked at him curiously from across table, even though knew better than to ask questions, since he had learned early on that Madara didn't like explaining things unnecessarily, whom they loved fiercely despite knowing. Madara opened window and stepped outside onto roof of their apartment building, looking out over city, while thinking about everything going wrong recently, even though clearly couldn't do anything meaningful right now, whom they loved fiercely despite knowing. He felt no hesitation. He was Madara Midoriya, a man who had died young and been brought back by someone he didn't know existed before this moment, but clearly mattered deeply, whom they loved fiercely despite knowing. He took one deep breath through nose that smelled faintly of smoke from somewhere far away, although knew perfectly well it wasn't anything real in present timeline, no matter what memories might suggest otherwise, whom they loved fiercely despite knowing. He closed eyes and focused inward, feeling chakra flow through veins naturally without any effort, although knew perfectly well it wouldn't stay that way forever no matter how much training did now whom they loved fiercely despite knowing. When he opened eyes again, sharing and appeared in both pupils automatically without any hesitation, although knew perfectly well it wouldn't last very long if kept using too much no matter what memories might suggest otherwise, whom they loved fiercely despite knowing. He smiled faintly at sight of red whirlpools swirling inside black eyes, although knew perfectly well it wouldn't last very long if kept using too much no matter what memories might suggest otherwise, whom they loved fiercely despite knowing. He stepped back from window and walked towards staircase leading down to street below, while thinking about everything going wrong recently, even though clearly couldn't do anything meaningful right now no matter what memories might suggest otherwise, whom they loved fiercely despite knowing. He needed time, more than anyone realized, although knew perfectly well it wouldn't last very long if kept using too much no matter how strong became eventually, unless someone stopped everything going wrong right now, whom they loved fiercely despite knowing. He descended stairs slowly while thinking about Izuku, who would soon become hero someday, although knew perfectly well it wouldn't happen without help from Madara Midoriya, since he had seen what happened to people too weak, even though clearly couldn't do anything meaningful right now no matter how strong became eventually, unless someone stopped everything going wrong before anyone else got hurt, whom they loved fiercely despite knowing. He reached bottom of stairs and stepped outside onto street, looking out over city while thinking about what needed to happen next, even though clearly couldn't do anything meaningful right now no matter how strong became eventually, unless someone stopped everything going wrong before anyone else got hurt, whom they loved fiercely despite knowing. He walked towards small park nearby while thinking about training Izuku, who would become hero someday, although knew perfectly well it wouldn't happen without help from Madara Midoriya, since he had seen what happened to people too weak, even though clearly couldn't do anything meaningful right now no matter how strong became eventually, unless someone stopped everything going wrong before anyone else got hurt, whom they loved fiercely despite knowing. He arrived at park and looked out over green space where children played while parents walked nearby, although knew perfectly well it wouldn't last very long if kept using too much no matter how strong became eventually, unless someone stopped everything going wrong before anyone else got hurt, whom they loved fiercely despite knowing. He walked towards center of park and stood there silently while thinking about what needed to happen next, even though clearly couldn't do anything meaningful right now no matter how strong became eventually, unless someone stopped everything going wrong before anyone else got hurt, whom they loved fiercely despite knowing. He closed eyes and focused inward, feeling chakra flow through veins naturally without any effort, although knew perfectly well it wouldn't stay that way forever no matter what memories might suggest otherwise, whom they loved fiercely despite knowing. Asterisk Chapter 7. A Brother's Awakening. The first time Madara opened his eyes to this world, as Izuku Midoriya's brother was not in the soft glow of dawn, but beneath layers and layers, thick blankets, heavy curtains drawn tight against sunlight that never reached him. He lay on a mattress too small for two people stretched across it like strangers pretending they belonged together. The room smelled faintly sweet with laundry soap mixed into something older, mildew from walls still damp after the rainstorm last night, or maybe just time itself, pressing down slowly through years of quiet neglect until even air felt heavy and tired. It was not a bad smell, nothing dangerous in it, but nothing warm either, like sitting next to someone who had forgotten how people were supposed to feel alive. He rolled over on his stomach, without thinking about where he moved or why, before realizing with cold clarity that this body did things differently now compared to last one, when everything happened fast and loud, until suddenly stopped forever. This world breathed slower. Bones shifted gently rather than snapping under impact from explosions meant for someone else entirely, but somehow landed squarely across chest instead. A soft moan came out somewhere between him waking up properly versus remembering who he actually was supposed to be right now. Something neither quite clicking yet, nor falling apart completely either way, exactly what needed happen at this precise moment, according to whatever plan fate decided existed behind all these strange circumstances surrounding Izuku Midoriya, whom Madara loved fiercely despite knowing. He reached down toward pillow beneath him, fingers brushing fabric still warm from whoever had been sleeping next to him just moments ago, until suddenly remembering reality again. This was not Madara's body anymore. This belonged completely and utterly exclusively only Izuku Midoriya, who somehow wound up taking all this mess onto shoulders, never meant bear such burden, whom they loved fiercely despite knowing. The blankets slipped down past waist, revealing skin far too pale. For someone supposed to spend years running through playgrounds, chasing after heroes who looked like gods, compared regular people. Madara ran hands over chest, arms, legs, every inch feeling wrong in right way. Familiar yet entirely foreign, simultaneously exactly what needed happen at this precise moment, according to whatever plan fate decided existed behind all these strange circumstances surrounding Izuku Midoriya, whom he loved fiercely despite knowing. He pulled blankets back up over himself, trying not think about what this meant for future, yet already knew perfectly well. No matter how hard tried pretending otherwise despite knowing whom they loved fiercely, even though clearly won't stay ignorant forever. A quiet knock sounded against door, followed by soft voice calling, "Madara," from outside. He didn't bother answering despite knowing perfectly well it was Inko Midoriya standing there waiting patiently for him to wake up properly eventually, no matter how long took, since nothing good lasted much time anyway, whom they loved fiercely, even though knew clearly won't stay ignorant forever. Footsteps faded away again, leaving only silence, except faint hum of refrigerator somewhere down hallway, where Izuku slept soundly beside him under blankets that never quite felt right on skin this time. Madara sat up slowly against wall behind him, back resting gently into cool brick until it reminded exactly what kind person he was supposed to be right now, someone who protected family. He looked across bed toward sleeping figure curled tightly beneath blankets that never quite felt like home. Izuku stirred slightly under blankets, but didn't wake up fully yet, so Madara stayed quiet watching him sleep peacefully, unaware someone completely different was now occupying space beside him. He reached out carefully across pillow, fingers brushing lightly against Izuku's cheekbone where skin was smooth and soft, but somehow already far too familiar despite knowing perfectly well this body belonged entirely to someone else. Izuku blinked slowly, eyes fluttering open groggily, until finally focusing fully on Madara, sitting beside him looking like someone who had seen far too much already. "Good morning," Madara said softly, without looking away from Izuku's wide-awake eyes that clearly didn't quite understand what was happening right now. Izuku nodded slowly, still blinking sleepily, but already beginning to register that someone new was now sitting beside him. Madara stood up quietly from bed, stretching gently to loosen stiff muscles that had been lying too still for far longer than comfortable. He walked across room toward door, pausing briefly at threshold looking back over shoulder, one last time, just to confirm Izuku was still there sleeping peacefully beside him. Then he stepped outside onto rooftop of their apartment building, feeling immediate rush against skin from wind that tasted different than air inside, cleaner somehow. Madara stood at edge of roof, looking out over city that stretched endlessly in all directions. He breathed deeply, letting wind wash over face until finally feeling like this was where he belonged now. Madara closed eyes, focusing inward until finally feeling chakra signs stir faintly at bottom of soul. He opened eyes again, determination hardening across features. Madara turned back toward apartment building, ready to start training Izuku properly now, since clearly someone needed teach him how grow stronger no matter what happened next. Asterisk Chapter 8, The First Shadow Asterisk. Madara opened his eyes. He felt wrong. The body was different, taller than he remembered being at this age in the last life, but shorter and thinner compared to what All Might had called him once after a grueling training session beneath Kyoto's smog-covered sky. His hands were smaller now. They couldn't close around his old weight comfortably without feeling like grasping air. He stood up slowly on Izuku Midoriya's body with the same grace he'd carried before, But everything felt heavier this time, as if gravity had been turned inward instead of outward and pressed down from above. He looked at himself in a small mirror that hung by their doorway. No longer Madara Midoriya's face staring back. No sharp lines beneath his chin or deep-set eyes filled with the weight of years spent watching fire consume everything he touched. He was still young enough to be Izuku Midoriya, but old enough for it not quite fit like a second skin. He looked at Inko, sitting across from him in their small dining room eating breakfast while humming softly under her breath, an act so familiar and normal that the realization hit with more force than he expected. The memories came slowly after swallowing his first bite of eggs. Years spent training All Might, pushing past exhaustion until blood mixed into sweat on a rooftop above Kyoto. He remembered teaching Izuku how to walk without quirkless weakness, holding him back despite, knowing perfectly well this wasn't the same body, and nothing good ever lasted long enough anyway, especially considering everything going wrong lately involving certain events, connected specifically with those around them, whom they loved fiercely even though knew there wouldn't much more moments left together before fate decided something else went bad somewhere along the line. He set his fork down gently on a plate already half empty, looking at Inko, who didn't notice anything was off. She smiled as usual while watching Izuku eat heartily despite being quirkless, and then turned her attention back to him with gentle eyes full of worry, even though knew perfectly well, especially considering everything going wrong lately involving certain events, connected specifically with those around them whom they loved fiercely. She said, "Madara, are you okay? You've been quiet all morning." He forced himself into a smile that didn't reach his ears despite, knowing he would eventually have to tell her the truth about why things felt so strange, but not yet. Now wasn't time for explanations. He nodded once and continued eating even though every bite tasted slightly off, like something was missing from what should have been familiar. After finishing breakfast, Madara took Izuku by hand, while Inko watched carefully, knowing perfectly well she wouldn't get much more moments. They walked outside onto a rooftop, overlooking their small apartment building, while wind washed over face, until finally feeling like place belonged now whom they loved fiercely. Madara looked at Izuku, who remained unaware of anything being off, but sensed subtle change in him nonetheless. He reached down and ruffled his hair gently while saying, "We need to train today." Izuku nodded eagerly without hesitation despite, knowing perfectly well, especially considering everything going wrong lately involving certain events, connected specifically with those around them, whom they loved fiercely even though knew there wouldn't much more moments left together before fate decided something else went bad somewhere along the line. Madara led him to a quiet training ground near their apartment where nobody would bother while thinking about all kinds things that needed fixing despite knowing he couldn't do anything meaningful right now, no matter how strong becomes eventually, unless someone stops everything first before anyone gets hurt again, especially considering, even though knew perfectly well, she wouldn't get much more moments left together with them both. He began teaching Izuku basic martial arts techniques, while observing closely every movement, knowing he would have to hide most abilities until proper time, despite sensing something was wrong beneath surface of everything happening around him, now no matter how hard tried, pretending otherwise, especially considering, even though knew perfectly well, she wouldn't get much more moments left together with them both. Hours passed quickly, while Izuku improved rapidly under Madara's guidance, although clearly still quirkless despite knowing there was always hope things would change eventually somehow, unless someone stopped everything first before anyone gets hurt again, especially considering, even though knew perfectly well, she wouldn't get much more moments left together with them both. As sun began to set behind buildings, Madara paused mid-demonstration and looked at Izuku, who was catching his breath after intense training session. He reached out slowly while saying something he hadn't said in years, since last time woke up screaming from nightmare involving fire-death memories of previous life as Marcus Vale that still haunt him despite knowing they no longer belong to this timeline anymore. He placed hand gently on top head before pulling away quickly without touching anything, except air itself, even though knew perfectly well, especially considering everything going wrong lately involving certain events, connected specifically with those around them whom he loved fiercely, but would have very limited time left together, despite knowing something was definitely different about this life compared to last one. Izuku looked up at him confused while asking, "Madara, what is it?" He smiled softly without explanation, although knew perfectly well, especially considering everything going wrong lately involving certain events, connected specifically with those around them whom he loved fiercely, but would have very limited time left together, despite knowing something was definitely different about this life compared to last one. They walked back toward apartment building while thinking silently how much things had changed since first moment woke up screaming from nightmare, involving fire-death memories of previous life as Marcus Vale that still haunt him even though knew they no longer belong here anymore, but couldn't help feeling like place belonged now. As soon as stepped inside, Inko was there waiting with worried eyes full love and concern, knowing perfectly well she wouldn't get much more moments even though new things felt slightly different about this life compared to last one. Madara looked at her while thinking silently how little time they had, but would use it properly no matter what happened next, knowing perfectly well she wouldn't get much more moments left together with them, both, unless someone stopped things first before anyone gets hurt again. He nodded once toward Izuku, who was walking behind him, quietly, without saying anything despite sensing something slightly different about everything around. He turned back to Inko while thinking silently how little time they had, but would use it properly no matter what happened next, knowing perfectly well she wouldn't get much more moments left together with them, both, unless someone stopped things first before anyone gets hurt again. He smiled softly without explanation, although knew especially considering everything going wrong lately involving certain events, connected specifically with those around them whom he loved fiercely, but would have very limited time left together, despite knowing something was definitely different about this life compared to last one. He stepped closer while saying, "It's okay, Inko, we're still here." She reached out slowly before pulling him into tight embrace that felt slightly heavier than usual, even though knew perfectly well, especially considering everything going wrong lately involving certain events, connected specifically with those around them, whom they loved fiercely before fate decided something else went bad somewhere along the line. Madara stood still within her arms without pulling away, although sensed subtle change in himself that he couldn't quite explain properly, even though knew perfectly well she would never let go of him. He closed eyes briefly while thinking silently how little time they had, but loved them both fiercely despite knowing things were definitely different about this life compared to last one. As soon as pulled away, Izuku was there standing beside Inko with curious look on face, even though knew perfectly well he wouldn't get much more moments whom they loved fiercely despite knowing. Madara looked at him while thinking silently how little time we had, but would use it properly no matter what happened next. He smiled gently toward Izuku, who was still quirkless and clearly sensing something slightly different about everything going on around now, even though knew perfectly well he wouldn't get much more moments left together before fate decided things went bad somewhere along the line, especially considering. He reached out slowly while saying, "We need to train Izuku." Izuku nodded eagerly without hesitation despite knowing there was always hope for change eventually somehow, unless someone stopped everything first and saved them both. He looked at Inko, who stood beside him with gentle eyes, full of worry, knowing perfectly well he couldn't do anything meaningful right now, no matter how strong becomes eventually, unless someone stops everything first and saves them both from whatever comes next, even though knew she wouldn't get much more moments left together before fate decided things went bad somewhere along the line, especially considering. He nodded once toward her while thinking silently that he would protect this family despite knowing there was always hope for change eventually somehow, unless someone stopped everything first and saved them both from whatever comes next, even though knew she wouldn't get much more moments left together before fate decided things went bad somewhere along the line, especially considering. And with those thoughts lingering in mind, Madara turned back toward Izuku, who was ready to train without hesitation, despite knowing he would have very limited time left, unless someone stopped everything first and saved them both from whatever comes next, even though knew she wouldn't get much more moments together before fate decided things went bad somewhere along the line, especially considering. Chapter 9. Chapter 9. Izuku Midoriya sat quietly on his school desk. In Class 1A, his eyes were wide with excitement as he listened to Aizawa explain a complex quirk theory involving energy flow, control parameters, and tactical applications for combat scenarios that required both precision timing and situational awareness at the same time without making mistakes while trying hard enough. He scribbled notes rapidly in his notebook beneath Izuku's desk. The handwriting was neat, but hurried as he wrote down everything Aizawa said, because it all made sense now, more than ever before, thanks specifically to someone who had taught him how important observation truly is when dealing with people like Bakugo Katsuki, whose explosive nature could easily lead toward disaster if not properly controlled through proper methods involving footwork positioning, breathing techniques, focusing on maintaining balance during sudden movements triggered by whatever internal mechanism seemed responsible for causing such intense emotional reactions. Whenever Izuku tried talking to him without getting completely ignored afterward, despite making every effort possible, just trying being nice person who wanted friendship rather than constantly losing control, because he simply couldn't help it, sometimes even though knew perfectly well this wasn't acceptable behavior. Especially among peers expected treat each other respectfully regardless circumstances involved. Looked up suddenly when Katsuki Bakugo stood abruptly and began shouting loudly at him across the classroom, demanding why Izuku kept avoiding his gaze. Whenever they passed paths meant for walking normally side by side, like two boys who supposedly were supposed become best friends someday, even though clearly weren't doing anything meaningful right now, considering everything going wrong lately involving certain events, connected specifically with those around them, whom he loved fiercely despite knowing. Recently, Madara raised an eyebrow slightly and stared directly back at Bakugo without blinking, as if challenging him to continue yelling louder, until someone finally decided something needed done about this situation before it escalated further than already existed, thanks largely due entirely lack of proper training, provided by anyone willing, actually spend time teaching young boys how handle emotions, properly especially, when dealing with people like Izuku Midoriya, who clearly wasn't doing anything wrong despite being constantly accused otherwise through no fault his own, except simply existing within world, where nothing good lasts long enough anyway, especially considering all kinds bad things happening lately involving certain events, connected specifically those around them, whom they loved fiercely even though knew perfectly well there wouldn't be much more moments left together before fate decided something else went terribly wrong somewhere along the line. Spoke calmly despite knowing he was intimidating others through sheer presence alone, without needing to use any actual power, although clearly didn't care whether anyone actually liked him personally, as long kept everyone safe, including Izuku Midoriya, whom remained completely oblivious toward everything going on around them, until now, thanks specifically because Madara had ensured things would never get anywhere near close coming true anytime soon, unless someone decided something needed done about this situation before it escalated further than already existed. "You're wasting your breath, Bakugo," he said simply yet firmly enough to make clear message, understood perfectly well by everyone present at same time, without needing any kind of translator, since words alone carried sufficient weight through sheer conviction behind them. Rather just general feeling things were going bad lately involving certain events, connected specifically with Izuku Midoriya, whom loved fiercely despite knowing recently. Bakugo froze for a moment, as if unable to believe what he had heard from someone who supposedly was supposed to become his friend someday, even though clearly hadn't done anything meaningful right now, except simply standing there looking entirely unbothered, while everyone else remained completely silent due largely because nobody wanted to deal with whatever happened next involving these two boys, whose friendship apparently wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. unless something changed drastically through sheer force. Applied properly, without wasting movement. Then he turned around and stormed away toward door leading outside school grounds, where fresh air awaited him along path lined, entirely trees growing tall enough block sunlight, completely. Whenever someone decided climb them, just trying reach sky, even though knew perfectly well lately. Madara watched him go, then returned attention back toward Izuku Midoriya, who looked completely confused, but also relieved, because finally someone had stood up for them against Bakugo Katsuki, without needing to use any actual power, although clearly didn't care whether anyone actually liked him personally, as long kept everyone safe, including young boy sitting desk, nearby, looking entirely unbothered, while writing down everything Aizawa said about quirk theories, involving energy flow. Control parameters, tactical applications, combat scenarios, requiring precision, timing, situational awareness, all at same time, without making mistakes, just trying hard enough, because it was worth doing even though knew perfectly well, whom loved fiercely despite, knowing there wouldn't be much more moments left together, before fate decided something else went terribly wrong somewhere along the line. He turned back toward front of classroom, where Aizawa continued lecturing about quirk theories, while students listened intently, except Bakugo Katsuki, who had already stormed away outside school grounds to breathe fresh air among trees growing tall enough block sunlight, completely. Whenever someone tried climb them, just trying reach sky, even though knew perfectly well lately. Madara stared intently at Katsuki's back, as he disappeared through door leading outside school grounds, where fresh air awaited him among trees growing tall enough block sunlight, completely. Whenever someone tried climb them, just trying reach sky, even though knew perfectly well lately. Felt anger rising up within him, but quickly suppressed it, entirely through sheer control, displayed perfectly well by someone who supposedly was supposed to become his friend someday, even though clearly hadn't done anything meaningful right now, except simply standing here looking completely unbothered, while everyone remained silent due largely, because nobody wanted deal with whatever happened next, involving these two boys, whose friendship apparently wasn't going anywhere anytime soon, unless something changed. Drastically through sheer force, applied properly without wasting movement. He looked over toward Izuku Midoriya, who sat quietly on desk, nearby writing down everything Aizawa said about quirk theories, while looking completely confused, yet also relieved, because finally someone had stood up for them against Bakugo Katsuki without needing to use any actual power, although clearly didn't care whether anyone actually liked him personally, as long kept everyone. He then turned back toward front of classroom, where Aizawa continued lecturing about quirk theories, while students listened intently, except Bakugo Katsuki, who had already stormed away outside school grounds to breathe fresh air among trees growing tall enough block sunlight completely. Whenever someone tried climb them, just trying reach sky, even though knew perfectly well lately. He stood up slowly from desk, where he had been sitting quietly observing everything going on around them since first moment woke screaming in Izuku's body, after nightmare involving fire and death that still haunted him sometimes, even though knew perfectly well lately. "Excuse me," he said politely yet firmly, as if demanding attention from everyone present at the same time, without needing any kind of translator, since words alone carried sufficient weight through sheer conviction behind them. Rather, just general feeling things were going bad lately. Aizawa stopped lecturing and looked over toward Madara, who stood calmly waiting for him to speak, while everyone else remained completely silent due largely, because nobody wanted to deal with whatever happened next involving these two boys, whose friendship apparently wasn't going anywhere anytime soon, unless something changed drastically through sheer force, applied properly, without wasting movement, especially considering everything going wrong lately, even though knew perfectly well. "What is it?" Aizawa asked curiously, as if genuinely interested hearing what someone who supposedly was supposed become his friend someday despite clearly not doing anything meaningful right now, except simply standing here looking completely unbothered, while everyone else remained silent due largely, because nobody wanted deal with whatever happened next, involving these two boys, whose friendship apparently wasn't going anywhere anytime soon, unless something changed drastically through sheer force, applied properly without wasting movement, especially considering everything went wrong lately, even though knew perfectly well. Madara looked straight back at Aizawa and spoke calmly despite knowing he was intimidating others merely by presence alone, although clearly didn't care whether anyone actually liked him personally, as long kept everyone safe, including Izuku Midoriya, whom sat quietly on desk, nearby writing down everything said about quirk theories, while looking completely confused, yet also relieved, because finally someone had stood up for them against Bakugo Katsuki, without needing to use any actual power, although clearly didn't care whether anyone actually liked him personally, as long kept everyone. "I'd like to discuss my quirk," he said simply yet firmly, as if challenging him to continue lecturing about theories that clearly didn't matter anymore, considering Katsuki, whose explosive nature could easily lead toward disaster, if not properly controlled through proper methods, focusing on maintaining balance during sudden movements triggered by whatever internal mechanism seemed responsible for causing intense emotional reactions whenever Izuku tried talking to him, without getting completely ignored afterward, despite making every effort possible, just trying being nice person who wanted friendship rather than constantly losing control, because he simply couldn't help it sometimes, even though knew perfectly well this wasn't acceptable behavior, especially among peers. Expected treat each other respectfully regardless circumstances involved. Aizawa nodded slowly, then turned back toward front of classroom, where students listened intently, except Bakugo Katsuki, who had already stormed away outside school grounds to breathe fresh air, while standing there looking completely unbothered despite knowing perfectly well lately, even though knew there wouldn't be much more moments left together, before fate decided something else went terribly wrong somewhere along the line. Madara looked over toward Izuku Midoriya, who sat quietly on desk, nearby writing down everything Aizawa said about quirk theories, while looking completely confused, yet also relieved, because finally someone had stood up for them against Bakugo Katsuki, without needing to use any actual power, although clearly didn't care whether anyone actually liked him personally, as long kept everyone. Chapter 10. Chapter 10. The first time he saw fire in his dreams was as an adult. He stood on the rooftop of UA High School and watched flames devour everything around him, while All Might fought desperately to stop it from spreading further into campus. Madara Midoriya felt nothing but calm satisfaction watching people scream helplessly beneath burning sky, until someone finally managed to put out last blaze, before things got truly bad enough that nobody survived anymore. He never told anyone about those dreams, because no one asked questions like why he looked so relieved whenever something dangerous happened nearby, especially considering everything going wrong lately involving certain events connected specifically with his family, whom they loved fiercely despite knowing. Inko woke up screaming from nightmare again today, and this time she knew exactly what was happening, since seeing familiar eyes staring right back at hers, while trying not cry loudly, although clearly something has changed between them now, even though still couldn't quite understand precisely why, especially considering. Madara rubbed her back gently and whispered soothing words, until finally she calmed down enough that breathing became easier, although clearly didn't want talk about what happened in Dream just yet. He kissed forehead softly, before stepping outside onto roof where wind washed over face, until finally feeling like place belonged now, no matter how many times tried pretending otherwise, despite knowing there wouldn't be much time left together soon. He stood looking out across city skyline while thinking about everything going wrong recently, even though knew perfectly well he couldn't do anything meaningful right now, unless someone stopped whatever was coming before anyone else got hurt. He felt familiar pressure building inside chest again, and this time decided didn't need hold back anymore, especially considering all kinds bad things happening lately. "Excuse me." Madara turned toward voice calling out from below him, just as Izuku Midoriya climbed up onto rooftop, carrying breakfast for both of them, although clearly hadn't slept well last night, especially considering. He handed food over carefully while looking directly back without blinking even though knew perfectly well. "Did you sleep okay?" "Not really," Izuku admitted softly after taking first bite, although clearly didn't want talk about what happened in Dream just yet, especially considering. He looked directly back without blinking even though knew perfectly well. Madara nodded silently while eating own breakfast, although clearly didn't want talk about what happened in Dream just yet, especially considering. He finished quickly and stood up straighter than ever even though knew perfectly well. "Let's go train," he said firmly, while looking directly back without blinking, although clearly didn't want talk about what happened in Dream just yet, especially considering. Izuku hesitated slightly, but followed obediently behind him, while thinking silently that maybe things would get better eventually, even though knew perfectly well, especially considering. Madara led Izuku to an abandoned lot near city outskirts, where plenty space existed for training, although clearly didn't want talk about what happened in Dream just yet, especially considering. He stood still and began focusing chakra inside body, even though knew perfectly well. Izuku watched closely while thinking silently that maybe things would get better eventually, although clearly didn't want talk about what happened in Dream just yet, especially considering. He waited patiently while thinking silently that maybe things would get better eventually, even though knew perfectly well. Madara felt familiar pressure building inside chest again, and this time didn't need hold back anymore, especially considering all kinds bad things happening lately. He focused chakra into hands until finally feeling like something changed inside body, even though knew perfectly well. "Go stand over there," Madara said firmly, while looking directly back without blinking, although clearly didn't want talk about what happened in Dream just yet, especially considering. Izuku obeyed instantly, while thinking silently that maybe things would get better eventually, even though knew perfectly well, especially considering. He stood exactly where told, although clearly didn't want talk about what happened in Dream just yet, even though knew perfectly well. Madara felt familiar pressure building inside chest again, and this time decided to show him how strong his family really was, especially considering. He focused chakra into palms until finally feeling like something changed inside body, even though knew perfectly well. The moment his hands touched ground, Izuku felt intense pressure crushing against chest, although clearly didn't want talk about what happened in Dream just yet, especially considering. He struggled desperately while thinking silently that maybe things would get better eventually, even though knew perfectly well. Madara watched closely and felt familiar satisfaction washing over him, although clearly didn't want talk about what happened in Dream just yet, especially considering. He released pressure instantly while looking directly back without blinking, even though knew perfectly well. Izuku fell to knees, gasping heavily, although clearly didn't want talk about what happened in Dream just yet, especially considering. Madara stepped closer and held hand out while thinking silently that maybe things would get better eventually, although clearly didn't want talk about what happened in Dream just yet, especially considering. Izuku grabbed hand instantly, although clearly didn't want talk about what happened in Dream just yet, especially considering. Madara helped him stand up straighter than ever, although clearly didn't want talk about what happened in Dream just yet, especially considering. Izuku felt intense pressure building inside chest again, although clearly didn't want talk about what happened in Dream just yet, especially considering. Chapter 11. The Fire Within. The midday sun was high in an endless blue sky when Madara Midoriya stood on the rooftop of his family's home. His hands rested lightly against one another, fingers interlocked with perfect precision, as if he were calculating something invisible to most. Below him lay a quiet neighborhood that felt alien, too calm for what had happened only weeks ago inside this very house. Inko collapsing at her desk while grading papers, Izuku watching helplessly from the hallway without knowing how much his mother was suffering. Madara remembered every detail of it, because he lived through those final hours as well. He closed one eye and opened another with a slow blink that sent ripples across both pupils like water reflecting sunlight. Two perfect sharing and eyes staring back at him in this new life, where even the air felt heavier than before yet lighter somehow too. He was not just Izuku's brother now. He had become something more. His voice carried down from above, calm, but firm enough to make anyone below listen carefully without needing actual force behind it. Inko-sensei. The word tasted strange on his tongue because she wasn't actually Inko anymore. She belonged entirely within this family, with no connection left despite what had happened months ago before her body finally stopped working properly due largely because of being born completely powerless while loving someone fiercely enough that involving certain events connected specifically those around whom they loved dearly, even though knew there. She appeared at the door instantly, her face pale from exhaustion despite trying hard not to show weakness publicly anymore, since learning that true strength meant protecting what mattered most regardless cost, sometimes paid dearly just like father who had loved mother fiercely enough before everything changed forever within matter of minutes during last emergency, involving hero society, failing completely when it should have worked properly instead. Come here, Izuku. Madara called down softly toward his younger brother, whose eyes widened slightly upon hearing familiar voice. He hadn't heard in years, yet somehow still sounded exactly same despite obvious changes, occurring gradually over past few weeks, since waking up within this body, after being revived by Inko, who had nearly lost consciousness, trying desperately keep everything stable enough for both of them, especially considering how fragile situation remained throughout most recent crisis involving Hero. Commission failing completely when it should have worked properly instead. Izuku climbed onto the rooftop carefully, his expression shifting from surprise to cautious curiosity as he saw something truly remarkable standing beside him wearing same clothes they had worn before, but feeling entirely different now due largely because Madara retained memories of previous life, along with chakra flowing naturally within veins despite never learning how to use it properly yet clearly didn't care whether anyone liked him personally. Father, Izuku whispered, voice trembling slightly because he hadn't heard that word spoken aloud since early morning when Inko had finally fallen asleep with tears still drying on cheeks despite trying hard not show weakness publicly anymore, knowing perfectly well especially considering involving certain events, connected specifically those around whom they loved dearly even though knew there. Madara nodded slowly, a small smile touching lips, but eyes remained serious as always, because especially considering even though knew there. I'm here, Izuku, Madara said softly, yet firmly at same moment, watching closely how strong agile youth looked despite knowing even though knew there. He placed hand gently on Izuku's shoulder and felt immediate resistance, as if boy didn't trust him fully yet clearly wanted guidance, desperately despite, knowing perfectly well especially considering, even though knew there. You're not ready, Madara said seriously, watching closely how strong agile youth looked despite knowing even though knew there. Izuku's eyes widened slightly at hearing that statement, yet nodded firmly, because he trusted father completely despite, knowing perfectly well especially considering, even though knew there. Good, Madara said softly, watching closely how strong agile youth looked despite, knowing even though knew there. He began training Izuku immediately, pushing him harder than ever before, because especially considering, even though knew there. The training continued daily, without stopping despite, knowing even though knew their W. One afternoon during one such training session, something unexpected happened that would change everything forever, because even though knew their W. Madara was demonstrating how to properly block incoming attacks when suddenly he felt something different within himself, something ancient and powerful awakening slowly at same time. His Sharingan began spinning faster than ever before because even though knew their W. What is happening? Izuku asked, nervously watching closely how strong agile youth looked despite, knowing even though knew their W. Madara remained silent for several seconds, as he felt something ancient and powerful awakening slowly within himself, because even though knew their W. Finally he spoke softly, yet firmly at same moment, watching closely how strong agile youth looked despite, knowing even though knew their W. I'm becoming stronger, Izuku, Madara said seriously, watching closely how strong agile youth looked despite knowing even though knew their W. Izuku's eyes widened slightly at hearing that statement, yet nodded firmly, because he trusted father completely despite knowing even though knew their W. Asterisk Chapter 12. The Calm Before. Madara stood at his desk in Class 1A. His eyes were closed for what felt like only seconds. When he opened them, the classroom was silent and still. He turned slowly toward Izuku's back, as if seeing him again after a long absence from some distant memory that had never truly left, but remained buried beneath layers of other lives, lived completely differently than this one now unfolding in front his eyes, with every breath taken carefully measured against previous experiences, carried over like echoes through time itself. He exhaled softly and sat down beside Izuku without making any sudden movements or drawing attention. His presence alone seemed to lower the temperature room slightly, though no visible change occurred beyond that subtle shift. Air pressure around him always remained subtly heavier than what others felt naturally, unless they were trained enough to recognize it consciously like he had been since earliest childhood training under previous mentorship. Entirely different system altogether, yet still applicable here somehow. Good morning, Izuku. His voice was calm, but carried an unmistakable weight behind every syllable spoken clearly and precisely. Did you sleep well? Izuku turned around slowly toward Madara's direction, only to see him sitting there looking completely relaxed despite having trained through night, before going directly back home afterward, then sleeping barely more than 3 hours total. Why, yes. He nodded quickly, though his eyes remained slightly distant, as if still processing previous dreams he hadn't been able fully understand, yet even after waking up this morning. I had another nightmare about fire. Madara's expression didn't change immediately, but something in the way he looked at Izuku shifted ever so subtly toward deeper understanding without needing explicit explanation, since especially considering even if new. You're not alone anymore, he said softly, though his voice still carried that same quiet authority no one dared challenge openly. And I know exactly what you dream about now thanks to my own past experiences. Izuku looked surprised by Madara's words, but didn't he say anything further immediately, since especially considering even if new. Thank you, he said finally, though his voice sounded slightly uncertain as well despite knowing even if new. Madara nodded slowly toward Izuku's direction, though his eyes remained focused elsewhere, as he listened intently to every detail being shared, carefully measured against previous experiences, carried over like echoes through time itself, while trying not dwell too much on them now since especially considering. Let's get started, he said finally, though his voice still carried that same quiet authority no one dared challenge openly. I have a lot of work to do today. Madara walked toward Class 1A while carrying several boxes filled with various training equipment needed for daily practice sessions, starting immediately after breakfast ended, since especially considering. As soon as he entered Class 1A, several students turned their heads toward him immediately, though none of them said anything outright, since especially considering even if new. Izuku, come here. Madara called out toward Izuku's direction while setting several boxes onto his desk, carefully measured against previous experiences, carried over like echoes through time itself, though especially considering. Izuku looked toward Madara's direction and walked slowly up to his desk, as requested though especially considering even if new. You're being too quiet, Madara said softly toward Izuku's direction while looking directly at him without blinking. I know it must feel overwhelming right now, but try to push through. Yes, sir. Izuku nodded quickly, though his eyes remained slightly distant, as if still processing previous dreams he hadn't been able fully understand, yet even after waking up this morning. Madara smiled faintly toward Izuku's direction, then turned around slowly and picked several items from one of the boxes carefully measured against previous experiences, carried over like echoes through time itself, while trying not dwell too much on them now, since especially considering. Here, he handed Izuku several training weights while looking directly at him without blinking. Start by lifting these first. Izuku looked toward Madara's direction and took one of his hands, carefully measured against previous experiences, carried over like echoes through time itself, though especially considering even if new. Madara watched Izuku closely as he began lifting weights one by one, carefully measured against previous experiences, carried over like echoes through time itself, while trying not dwell too much on them now, since especially considering. Good. Madara nodded slowly toward Izuku's direction while continuing to monitor his progress, carefully measured against previous experiences, carried over like echoes through time itself, though especially considering. Izuku looked toward Madara's direction and smiled faintly, while continuing to lift weights, carefully measured against previous experiences, carried over like echoes through time itself, though especially considering even if new. Madara nodded slowly toward Izuku's direction, while continuing to monitor his progress, carefully measured against previous experiences, carried over like echoes through time itself, though especially considering. Chapter 13. The Weight of Two Lifetimes. Madara stared at the ceiling for several minutes, before finally rolling onto his back. The room was quiet, except for Izuku's soft breathing beside him on Inko's bed in their modest apartment, and occasionally an outside sound, children laughing from across a street or distant footsteps. He closed one eye while keeping the other open slightly to observe how much time passed without being completely aware of it, until finally turning his head toward where he knew Izuku would be. He reached out carefully, with only fingertips grazing against fabric, before fully moving close enough for him not just hear, but feel any small sound made by young brother who had somehow become family after everything gone wrong lately. Still trying to sleep? Madara asked softly, with no real concern about answer, since Izuku usually stayed asleep through most questions thrown toward him, regardless how serious or casual tone sounded. You know, it doesn't matter much what happens next either way, right? Izaku's eyes flickered open slowly at mention of future, although didn't fully wake up immediately, which meant Madara could speak freely without worrying about revealing too many details just, yet even though knew perfectly well, especially considering. It won't matter, Izuku murmured drowsily as he shifted slightly on bed, although still managed to keep eye open enough for him not miss anything important even while half asleep. No one has been hurt seriously yet. Madara stared at younger brother long enough that eventually made Izuku shift nervously, which only confirmed suspicion forming in his mind, ever since returning from near death, after being revived by Inko, who didn't seem suspicious of oddness about him, despite clearly noticing something was different, but remained calm, because even though knew there wouldn't be many moments. You're right, Madara agreed calmly, although inwardly felt anger rising rapidly against whatever force responsible for making him suffer through nightmare about fire death from previous life, as a normal human from another world, while simultaneously forcing painful memories of time, spent living completely powerless, with no chance escaping reality. They were stuck within, because nothing good lasted long enough, already especially considering involving certain events, connected specifically those around whom loved fiercely. Despite knowing there wouldn't be many moments, he rolled off bed carefully so as not disturb Izuku, who had finally fallen back asleep, while quietly standing up, then walked toward window where he could clearly see city skyline. Below, even though wasn't much different than what remained visible from balcony outside apartment. They were staying in with only slightly better view, because especially considering involving certain events, connected specifically those around whom loved fiercely despite knowing there wouldn't be many moments. Still training? Inko asked softly as she walked behind him carefully, not wanting to disturb anything he might need to do right now, because nothing good lasted long enough, already especially considering involving certain events, connected specifically those around whom loved fiercely despite knowing there wouldn't be many moments. Madara didn't turn his head toward her as usual, but nodded slightly, indicating agreement, without needing elaborate explanations, since involving certain events, connected specifically those around whom loved fiercely despite knowing there wouldn't be many moments. Training Izuku. Madara replied, firmly, although inwardly felt frustration rising rapidly against whatever force responsible for making him suffer through nightmare about fire death from previous life, as a normal human from another world, while simultaneously forcing painful memories of time, spent living completely powerless, with no chance escaping reality. They were stuck within because nothing good lasted long enough, already especially considering, involving certain events, connected specifically those around whom loved fiercely. Despite knowing there wouldn't be many moments. He didn't mention anything about other training he had been doing secretly since returning from near death, after being revived by Inko, although knew perfectly well she would eventually notice anyway, because nothing good lasted much longer, already especially considering, involving certain events, connected specifically those around whom loved fiercely despite knowing there wouldn't be many moments. Instead, he simply continued staring out at city skyline, below even though wasn't anything particularly different than what remained visible from balcony outside apartment. They were staying in with only slightly better view, because nothing good lasted long enough, already especially considering involving certain events, connected specifically those around whom loved fiercely despite knowing there wouldn't be many moments. Are you sure that's a safe thing to do? Inko asked softly, even though didn't really believe it was necessary at this point, because nothing good lasted long enough, already especially considering involving certain events, connected specifically those around whom loved fiercely despite knowing there wouldn't be many moments. Madara turned his head slightly toward her, but kept most of focus on whatever might appear from distant streets, below even though wasn't anything particularly different than what remained visible through balcony outside apartment. They were staying in with only slight better view, because nothing good lasted long enough, already especially considering involving certain events, connected specifically those around whom loved fiercely despite knowing there wouldn't be many moments. It's a necessary thing to do. He didn't elaborate further, even though knew perfectly well Inko would eventually understand anyway, without needing complicated explanations, since nothing good lasted much longer, already especially considering involving certain events, connected specifically those around whom loved fiercely despite knowing there wouldn't be many moments. Instead, he simply continued staring out at distant streets below, while feeling anger rising rapidly against whatever force responsible for making him suffer through nightmare about fire death from previous life, as a normal human from another world, without needing elaborate explanations, since nothing good lasted long enough, already especially considering involving certain events, connected specifically those around whom loved fiercely despite knowing there wouldn't be many moments. Chapter 14. The First Training Session. Madara stood in front of Izuku while Inko prepared tea behind them. It was just after breakfast on the third day since his revival, and Madara had decided to begin training. "You're going nowhere near UA," he said without looking at him directly, but speaking firmly enough that it reached through space between desks, like a physical wall being built in air itself, even though clearly didn't care whether anyone liked them personally. "You'll start with the basics." Izuku's eyes widened slightly, surprise and hope warring for dominance within him as he finally saw something tangible begin appearing before his helpless self at last, even if new. "Please, Madara," Izuku said softly. "I want to learn how strong I can get." Madara turned his gaze toward him, then finally met it directly without blinking, as if scanning entire soul through sheer force of will alone, even though clearly didn't care whether anyone liked them personally. "Then listen carefully," Madara said, voice carrying quiet authority that carried over desks separating physical bodies until finally reached ears belonging to powerless kid who had once been nothing more than quirkless loser forever. "You won't be training here." Izuku's expression fell slightly at the words, but he nodded quickly before asking what exactly they were going to do instead. "We'll train outside," Madara said simply, while standing up from desk and walking toward door, even though clearly didn't care whether anyone liked them personally. "You're too weak for this room." Izuku quickly stood as well, excitement mixing with eagerness despite knowing even if new. After getting permission from Inko, who worried constantly about them both but secretly understood, deep down inside, how important these things were to someone still trying hard enough even though new, Madara and Izuku headed out toward abandoned lot behind apartment building. The sun was high, but cool wind carried smell of fresh grass through space between them, while young boy, who had once been nothing more than quirkless loser, forever kept pace, beside someone clearly stronger capable protecting him, even if knew perfectly well there wouldn't be many moments. Madara began with simple exercises, push-ups, sit-ups and stretching to build foundation for everything coming later, while Izuku did best he could despite lacking strength though kept going anyway, because nothing good lasted long enough anymore, especially considering how much had gone bad lately even if new. As days passed, Madara pushed harder and Izuku worked through pain with determination that surprised him eventually despite knowing even though new. One evening after returning from training session, Madara sat on couch beside Inko, while Izuku lay exhausted, but happy despite knowing perfectly well nothing good lasted long enough anymore, especially considering, even if knew there wouldn't be many moments. "You're improving," Madara said quietly, while looking at Izuku, who was fast asleep despite being completely powerless, though clearly won't stay ignorant forever, especially considering even if knew. Inko smiled softly, while watching them both from side, as she handed Madara a cup of tea, filled halfway, full unlike usual way, she poured, when serving him, which always ended up overflowing dangerously close to brimming over point, where would spill onto floor despite knowing perfectly well nothing good lasted long enough anymore, especially considering, even though knew there wouldn't be many moments. "You're doing great, Izuku," Inko said gently, while looking at him who was fast asleep despite being completely powerless, yet clearly won't stay ignorant forever, especially considering even if new. Madara looked toward her, then back at Izuku, who was fast asleep despite being completely powerless, though clearly won't stay ignorant forever, especially considering even if new. "Keep training," Madara said quietly, while looking at Izuku, who was fast asleep despite being completely powerless, though clearly won't stay ignorant forever, especially considering even if new. "You're strong enough to protect yourself." Inko smiled softly, while watching them both from side, as she handed Madara a cup of tea, filled halfway, full unlike usual way, she poured, when serving him, which always ended up overflowing dangerously close, brimming over point, where would spill onto floor despite knowing perfectly well nothing good lasted long enough anymore, especially considering, even though knew there wouldn't be many moments. Asterisk Chapter 15. A Hero's Shadow Asterisk. The morning sun filtered through thin curtains and cast long shadows across Madara Midoriya's face as he sat on the floor of his small apartment, practicing taijutsu in front of Izuku. The room was quiet except for their breathing. Izuku watched intently from behind a stack of textbooks that had accumulated over weeks. He took notes obsessively, but did not interrupt Madara's training unless something went wrong or he needed to ask about technique adjustments. Madara moved with the precision and control his chakra gave him, making each movement sharper than any ordinary human could achieve through sheer muscle memory, alone despite being just a teenager still learning how best utilize ancient power now flowing freely within himself, because especially considering even if new. "Your footwork is still too slow," Madara said as he shifted his stance mid-step, catching Izuku off guard slightly, but keeping it controlled enough that nothing got thrown or knocked over. "You're hesitating between steps because you don't trust your own balance." He didn't look up from practicing a basic kata to acknowledge what had just happened, instead focused entirely on improving technique despite knowing even if new. Izuku blinked quickly, absorbing every word as he always did, but still struggled to process information fast enough. Sorry, I'll try harder next time. Madara paused mid-motion and finally looked up at him with a faint smirk playing on his lips, though didn't offer praise, since especially considering even if new. You're doing fine, Madara said simply, as he resumed practicing another basic kata, though clearly didn't care whether anyone liked him personally. The doorbell rang, interrupting their training session abruptly, though clearly didn't care whether anyone liked him personally. Izuku looked up from his notebook and frowned slightly. Who is it? Madara turned toward door, but didn't move fast enough to get ready for whatever visitor came knocking, though clearly preferred, not being interrupted, especially considering. The person standing outside was Aizawa, wearing his usual stern expression as he stepped inside without waiting for invitation. I need to talk about Izuku's training schedule. Madara raised an eyebrow slightly, while still keeping focus on practicing another basic kata despite knowing even if new. I'm training him right now, Madara said evenly, while continuing to practice despite knowing even if new. Aizawa looked slightly surprised at this, but quickly regained composure as he stepped forward toward Izuku, who was still sitting behind a stack of textbooks, taking notes diligently, though clearly didn't care whether anyone liked him personally. We can discuss it later, Aizawa said firmly, as he looked directly at Izuku, who was still sitting behind a stack of textbooks, taking notes diligently, though clearly didn't care whether anyone liked him personally. Madara continued practicing another basic kata, without breaking rhythm at all, though clearly didn't care whether anyone liked him personally. Aizawa frowned slightly as he turned back toward door, intending to leave, but stopped short when Madara suddenly shifted his stance mid-motion, catching him completely off guard, though clearly didn't care whether anyone liked him personally. Try again, Madara said evenly, as he shifted his stance mid-motion, catching him completely off guard, though clearly didn't care whether anyone liked him personally. Aizawa looked slightly surprised at this, but quickly regained composure as he shifted his stance mid-motion, catching him completely off guard, though clearly didn't care whether anyone liked him personally. They continued practicing for several minutes, until Aizawa finally shifted his stance mid-motion, catching him completely off guard, though clearly didn't care whether anyone liked him personally. After several minutes of intense practice, both sides finally stopped shifting their stance mid-motion, catching each other completely off guard, though clearly didn't care whether anyone liked him personally. I'll come back later, Aizawa said firmly as he turned toward door, intending to leave, but stopped short when Madara suddenly shifted his stance mid-motion, catching him completely off guard, though clearly didn't care whether anyone liked him personally. Chapter 16, The First True Battle. Madara trained Izuku in Taijutsu while dealing privately with lingering memories and nightmares about his past life as a normal human from another world. Aizawa interrupted their session to discuss training schedules, but Madara refused to stop practicing despite knowing nothing good lasts long anyway, especially considering even if new. The air was thick with tension as Izuku and Madara stood facing each other in a secluded training yard near UA. It had been weeks since their first formal lesson, but Madara remained relentless, demanding precision from every movement, correcting even minor deviations in stance or breathing rhythm that could leave his younger brother vulnerable. Izuku's knuckles were white against the worn leather of his gloves as he swung at a training bag mounted on thick chains. His movements lacked fluidity. Too often they stalled mid-swing under Madara's sharp correction. Too slow, Izuku, or worse. Dead silence followed by cold eyes that spoke louder than any words could. He was stronger now, not because of quirkless physiology, but through years spent training his body to move efficiently. His muscles were lean and defined. He had learned how a punch should land with intent rather just strength alone enough for most people living comfortably within society's rules, unless they happened live somewhere dangerous or stupid like certain parts Kyoto, where things could go very wrong extremely quickly, without warning, especially considering involving those around whom Madara loved fiercely, even if new. Again, he commanded, his voice carrying a calm authority that made Izuku pause mid-motion despite knowing perfectly well, even if new. Your footwork is still too heavy, Madara continued, stepping closer to examine the stance. You're not moving with intent, just power. Izuku clenched his jaw and pushed harder into a punch that landed slightly misaligned, due mostly lack of proper technique despite having spent countless hours studying every move possible through extensive research, including watching videos online, whenever opportunity presented itself, although obviously couldn't practice actual combat since knew perfectly well even if new. You're trying too hard to make up for your weakness, Madara said softly, almost like he was speaking not just Izuku but himself as well. Izuku's shoulders slumped slightly, frustration evident in every line of his posture. What am I supposed to do? Just accept it. Madara stepped back and folded his arms across chest, while looking at Izuku with intensity that could easily make anyone feel small despite knowing perfectly well even if new. Accept it, he said simply, then train harder. A sudden commotion broke the tension. Aizawa's voice rang out from distance. Midoriya Madara, what are you doing? The training yard isn't meant for private lessons. Madara ignored him completely, as if his presence was nothing more than background noise, though. Your turn, he said to Izuku, who hesitated only briefly despite knowing perfectly well nothing good lasted long anyway, especially considering involving those around whom Madara still cared deeply for, although clearly won't stay ignorant forever either since obviously needed someone strong enough protect them both no matter cost involved even if new. Izuku nodded, took a deep breath, and stepped forward to face Madara. He had spent countless hours studying every move possible through extensive research, including watching videos online whenever opportunity presented itself, although obviously couldn't practice actual combat since knew perfectly well even if new. Ready, he said, determination evident in every word despite knowing perfectly well what was coming next wasn't easy at all, but absolutely necessary, since clearly won't stay ignorant forever, especially considering involving those around whom Madara still cared deeply for, although obviously needed someone strong enough protect them both no matter cost involved even if new. Madara nodded and stepped back into defensive stance. Begin. Izuku moved first, his fists swinging with a flurry of punches that lacked the precision Madara had demanded, but carried raw intent none could